In this segment, we are going to work through a full process costing example. ABC Company had the following production information for the month of April. They began the month with 30,000 units of inventory that had been partially completed in the prior month. Those inventory items were 100% complete with respect to the materials, and they were only 65% complete with respect to their direct labor. And we're going to assume that overhead and direct labor, or conversion, is all completed at an even rate. During the month of April, 90,000 units had been started. By the end of April, 100,000 units had been completed and transferred out. That left 20,000 units of inventory on hand at the end of the period that had all their materials added and had 25% of their labor and conversion for overhead added and completed. The cost associated with all this production was as follows. Their beginning inventory, materials, labor, and overhead cost totaled $4,620. During April, another $9,900 of materials, $5,700 of labor, and $6,840 of factory overhead costs were incurred. Thus, we had total costs of $27,060 of costs that were recorded in the goods in process, work in process account during the period that need to be accounted for. So in order to apply a weighted average cost flow system of equivalent units in a process costing system, we have to do 4 steps. Step number 1 is to determine and identify the physical flow of units. Once we follow the physical flow of units, we will then calculate the number of equivalent units of production. Then we will compute the cost incurred per equivalent unit. And using that cost per equivalent unit, we will assign and reconcile the cost. So let's first determine the physical flow of units of production during the month of April. Recall ABC began with 30,000 units on hand, and they started another 90,000 units. That means we had 120,000 units of inventory that had been started and in process during the month of April. Of those 120,000 units, 100,000 units were completed and transferred out, ready for sale, leaving 20,000 units still in process and an ending inventory with respect to goods in process. The 120,000 units that we needed to account for have been accounted for, 100,000 completed and transferred out, 20,000 in ending inventory. Step 1 is completed. We have identified the physical flow of units. Now we're going to calculate the number of equivalent units that could have been produced had we used our efforts to only complete whole units. With respect to direct materials, and we have to evaluate the equivalent units separately for materials and labor and overhead because these items are applied at different rates. The direct materials, for the 100,000 units that were completed and transferred out, we know they must have been 100% complete because they would not have been completed and transferred out if they did not have all of their materials added. So the 100,000 units transferred out times the 100% percentage of completion gives us 100,000 equivalent units. For the 20,000 units that were in process at the end of the period, they had all of their materials added. So they were 100% complete with respect to direct materials. So the number of units times the percentage completion gives us 20,000 equivalent units. Total equivalent units of 120,000 units with respect to direct material. For labor and factory overhead, take the number of units transferred out times their percentage completion. If they were transferred out, they must have had all of their labor and overhead costs 100% complete. Total equivalent units of 100,000. However, However, for the units that were in ending goods in process, 20,000 units, they were only 25% complete with respect to their labor and overhead. 20,000 times their 25% completion means 5,000 equivalent units. In other words, if we had used our labor and overhead costs to only make whole units instead of some whole units and some partially completed units, we could have made a total of 105,000 equivalent units. So if we take our equivalent units with respect to materials and our equivalent units with respect to labor and overhead, we can use those equivalent units to calculate a cost per equivalent unit. We take the material cost from beginning inventory, add it to the material cost added during the period to get total material cost. Total material cost divided by total material equivalent units gives us a cost per equivalent unit. We do the same for labor and overhead. Beginning inventory cost plus the cost added, divide by the equivalent units to get a cost per equivalent unit with respect to labor and overhead. When we reconcile these costs, which is the fourth and final step, we will account for all costs incurred by assigning costs to the 100,000 units that were transferred out and 20,000 units that were still remaining in inventory. So the cost we needed to account for, 4,620 plus 22,440 added, $27,060 worth of cost in goods in process. We are going to take the number of equivalent units for the inventory that was transferred out and multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit. 100,000 equivalent units with respect to materials times an 11-cent cost per equivalent unit. $11,000 in material costs need to be transferred to finished goods. Labor, 100,000 equivalent units times the cost per equivalent unit of 6 cents. $6,000 worth of labor costs need to be transferred to finished goods. And finally, factory overhead, number of equivalent units times the cost per equivalent unit. We need to transfer $7,200 to finished goods. Total cost in goods in process that need to be transferred to finished goods, $24,200. For the ending goods in process cost, number of equivalent units for direct materials, 11-cent cost per equivalent unit. $2,200 needs to remain in goods in process. Direct labor, 5,000 equivalent units times the cost per equivalent unit to get $300. And for factory overhead, the 5,000 equivalent units in ending goods in process times the cost per equivalent unit. Of the $27,060, $2,860 needs to remain in goods in process because it is associated with the units still in process at the end of the period. We have accounted for the full $27,060 that was recorded in goods in process. So our journal entry would be a debit to finished goods and a credit to goods in process inventory for the costs that are associated with the completed items that need to be transferred from goods in process to finished goods.